good evening, or depending on when you watch this video, good morning or good afternoon. I'm Nolan Siegel, coming to you from Vanderbilt University here in Nashville, Tennessee. As many of you, my viewers, will likely know, next week, the week of November 2nd, 2020, has a very important day in it. Tuesday, November 3rd, is Election Day. Once every 4 years, we Americans have the opportunity to choose who sits behind the Resolute desk for the next 4 years. We get to choose who the next president of the United States will be. We get to elect the president, we get to elect other representatives, we get an opportunity, as many believe, to share our voice in the federal government. In that context of such importance being given to one day, there's been a lot of chatter about Election Day, of course. There are countless news articles posted every day, infinitely many Instagram graphics, and an innumerable number of offhand conversations about candidates, about what time votes will be counted by, about everything related to Election Day. My personal favorite reflection over this Election Day actually isn't any of those three things. It's a little bit different. It's a West Wing special to benefit when we all vote. What is the West Wing? Well, the West Wing is a political drama that offers an inside look into the life and times of the staffers of President Josiah Jed Bartlett's fictional White House administration. The West Wing was a TV show that ran from 1999 through 2006, and it's fantastic. The West Wing won 98 awards from 284 nominations during its run. That's really impressive. For comparison, the #1 rated TV show on IMDb, Planet Earth 2, won 13 awards from 21 nominations. So the West Wing was doing something right. This October, the West Wing cast came together to reenact an episode from its 3rd season, to reenact Hartsfield's Landing. I'd like to share with you a video about the West Wing special.
Welcome home, Mr. President.
Thank you. What'd I miss?
The West Wing, we wanted to see if we could push people to the polls, push West Wing viewers to the polls, and very quickly HBO Max became involved in something that I think started out as what was supposed to be just a Zoom table read, became something a lot more.
It was kind of unbelievable. First of all, it was joyous that we could all be together again. It was joyous also in this environment where beyond that we could all be together again as a cast, that we could just be with human beings.
What Tommy did was take an episode from season 3, it's called Hartsfield's Landing, and it ends up being kind of an ode to voting. And he restaged it entirely as a play at the Orpheum Theater downtown. We didn't change a word of it. Tommy simply restaged it as a play and then shot that play in the style of a modern Playhouse 90.
But what was stunning was how quickly these actors just fell right back in to the characters. It's like when it's a family reunion, you come back and you start to act like you did when you were in the house being raised by your parents. And they just fell right back into place and went right into character. And it was, as I said, we didn't have rehearsal. They just sat down and just did it. And it was kind of stunning and very, very moving for me.
In the act breaks where the commercials would normally go, that's when you'll hear from people like Mrs. Obama or President Clinton or Samuel L. Jackson or Elizabeth Moss. And I'll say this, and you can feel free to roll your eyes if you want, but this is a nonpartisan effort. We are, just like when we all vote as a nonpartisan organization, we're trying to push fans of the West Wing to the polls.
In his interview, series creator and screenwriter of The West Wing, Aaron Sorkin, calls the episode Hartsfield's Landing, the episode reenacted in this special, he calls it an ode to voting. So just as Hartsfield's Landing was relevant in 2002, just as the message about voting was relevant in 2002, so too does he and the West Wing team deem the message relevant today in 2020, 18 years later. Just as the actors fell right back into character, so too does society fall right back into the message from Hartsfield's Landing that voting is important. Throughout the special, high-profile speakers talk about why everyone should vote, in addition to the episode following a plot line about why everyone should vote. So the special really drives home the message that voting is important and we should vote this year and every year in the future. However, the episode leaves us with a few questions, the biggest of which, our big question for today's talk show, to what extent do our individual votes matter? Today, we're going to delve into that question. Thank you for joining me. I can't wait to begin this journey with you. We'll answer that question of whether voting matters by looking at two key attributes related to voting. Impact. Does voting shape policy? And number two, importance. Does voting matter beyond policy? Today in our talk show, we'll have a few different sections, and each section will have some sort of preface or interlude during which I'll summarize and analyze what we'll learn from different interviews, and each section will have an interview. Today's sections will consist of number one, the publicly perceived side of voting, with Frances Levy and Cassidy Latchford, two of the co-presidents of Vandy Votes, and Alyssa Garcia, Vanderbilt Student Government's Director of Active Citizenship and Service. Number two, who shapes U.S. policy, with political science professors Larry Bartels and Josh Clinton. Number three, we'll identify a gap between our political expectations and our reality, with sociology professor Josh Murray. Number four, we'll talk about the perceived vote versus the realistic vote, with political science professor and College of Arts and Science dean John Geer. And number five, we'll talk about how we find the future, with professor of political science Allison Anoll. We'll begin with the publicly perceived side of voting, with Frances Levy and Cassidy Latchford, two of the co-presidents of Vandy Votes, and with Alyssa Garcia, the Director of Active Citizenship and Service for the Vanderbilt Student Government. Cassidy, Frances, Alyssa, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited to speak with you about voting, its impact, its importance. Let's get right into it. I was wondering if we could begin with maybe some quick introductions, if you could each introduce yourselves, your organizations, your roles within your organizations, and sort of how you mobilize people to vote, please.
Hi, I'm Cassidy Latchford. I'm one of the co-presidents of Vandy Votes, along with Frances and Tess, who unfortunately could not be here. Frances, Tess, and I have worked this summer, and in July, Vandy Votes became a student organization. One of our main goals is to make Vanderbilt an actual voting campus, to have a lot of our students, ideally 100% of our students at the polls and registered and voting. We really want to uplift the voices of those who've been disenfranchised and make sure everyone on campus, no matter what their identity, can vote and can exercise their right to vote.
Hi, I'm Frances Levy. I'm one of the other co-presidents of Vandy Votes. A huge kind of goal of our organization has been to just inform people about the process of how to register and kind of how to vote and like what your options are. Because being a college student, you can vote on your college campus, or you can vote where you're from. So just like informing people about what their choices are in that way and helping them make that decision for themselves so they can use their voice where they think the policies and governance most affects them.
Yeah, hi, my name is Alyssa Garcia. I'm the Director of Active Citizenship and Service for Vanderbilt Student Government. And this year we're really emphasizing like that active citizenship portion. So what I've been doing is just kind of working with student orgs like Vandy Votes and Vote at Vandy and kind of recognizing like what needs they might have and then trying to make sure that that is in collaboration with the resources that VSG has. Like, we have good funds and we have connection to the administration. And so I just want to make sure that like every barrier to voting that they have identified for students, like we can help break those down so that our voter participation is very high this year.
Thank you. So Alyssa, you talk about voter participation being high. There's a pretty widely held belief that voting is a way of participating in our country's democracy. And Chancellor Diermeyer actually has a wonderful quote about this. I'll read it to you. Voting is the most fundamental action of participating in a democracy. At Vanderbilt, our aim is to prepare students to be leaders in all aspects of their lives, including civic engagement. The Vanderbilt Let's Vote initiative empowers students to learn about the issues and actively participate in shaping the future they want to see. So Chancellor Diermeyer is talking about how important it is for students to vote to participate in our democracy, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit. So Alyssa, we'll pop back to you. What do you think it means to participate in our democracy?
I think the thing about our democracy and our government is that it is so like omnipresent in every part of our life. We're all affected by the laws in place and like the rules that we need to follow. And so like the important word here is like to participate and switching around that narrative so that people understand like they have a power in shaping the rules and the laws that they're following and that are affecting them. And so I think voter participation and like your vote is your first like way to participate. It's your easiest way to tell people like these are the policies and the ideas that I support and kind of push for those to be implemented through laws.
Thank you. Francis Cassidy, what do you think?
Going off of that, I think participating in a democracy is like a great way to like demonstrate your voice and what policies matter to you and kind of what you want out of a representative government that we have in the US. I also think voting is such a good way to participate in our democracy because we talk about a lot how it's like a duty, like it's your duty to vote if you qualify to be a voter. Voting is really a privilege because not everybody's always gotten that. And so by like empowering students to vote, we're helping them like latch onto that privilege and say like, how am I going to make my democracy and like my future better?
Francis, I think it's interesting that you use the word privilege. May I ask if there's anything that leads to you using that choice of wording instead of any other wording?
Yeah, so the main reason I use privilege around talking about voting is that, so voting historically, we have under the Constitution, it was for white landowning males. And then slowly we have seen throughout the history of our nation, suffrage extended to different groups, whether that be landowning white or non-landowning white males, and then we see that extended to women in 1920, and then we see suffrage extended to African Americans in the 1960s. So we have this like constantly changing narrative of who has the right to vote, but it has never been easy, and it's always been hard for a lot of marginalized groups to vote. And so I think we have a privilege and we have a duty, or it's beyond a duty, we have a privilege in voting. And so using that effectively is kind of how we're going to shape our future.
Thank you. All right, Cassidy, we'll come to you now with the original question. What does it mean to participate in a democracy?
Yeah, I second everything Alyssa and Francis said. I believe that not only does voting allow us to have a voice in the policies and the representatives that represent us, but it also holds us accountable to be actually engaged in our politics and what is happening day to day and what are the recent developments. And I think being able to participate in a democracy from voting just requires that you know, who am I voting for? What do these people stand for? And it just allows us to have more participation on a daily basis, either through the news or watching or keeping updates with what is going on. But in the same way, it just allows people just to know what is going on and to also to shape those policies and to really have their voice put out on a ballot and to see, yes, these are the people I want to have in. And it just voting, having more people vote just allows America to become actually a representative democracy and not just a democracy for the small people who are able to vote.
Thank you. So Cassidy, it sounds like you're coming to one word, at least in my brain. It sounds like you're coming a lot to the word shape, which is actually echoed in Chancellor Dearmeyer's quote. Here's the little excerpt. He says that voting lets us shape the future we want to see. So Cassidy, we'll start with you. To what extent does voting let us shape the future of the country? To what extent does voting dictate the policy of the country? What do you think?
I think voting allows just regular citizens to have a voice in which people represent them, and usually the politicians have like policies put on hold. So voting for a certain politician allows each person to know these are the policies they're going to fight for, and these are the policies I want to see. So I think it is a huge step, just like as they said, it's really a first step to getting people more engaged in politics, as well as making sure that the people that are representing them are actually representing the policies that they want.
Thank you. Francis, Alyssa, what do you think?
I think like Cassie said, like we are a representative democracy. And so the way that we shape our policies is by who we elect and who then directly has the power to implement these laws and these changes. So I think if we're talking specifically about like college students, which is what, you know, we've all been focusing on in our positions, we are like a group that does not vote very much. And I think if you look at a lot of districts or a lot of states, like the number of votes that determined an election are often less than the number of like young people who did not turn out to vote. And so I think, you know, with this election, it's wonderful how like the idea of voting has been spoken about so much, and how more and more people are becoming engaged, because that in that way you're making this new voice like heard, and you're making this new voice affect who is in power, and in that way then politicians become more responsive to the voice of these young people. And we are, you know, we do have different opinions, and I think that's a really wonderful thing to see, that like our power to shape the democracy is something that we're really embracing now. So
Yeah, going off, I agree with everything that Alyssa and Cassie have said. And I also think voting is just like such a great way. It's your first way to plug in civically into our democracy, and it's your first way to kind of have your voice represented once you're 18, and if you qualify for voting within the US. So I think it is just like a great way to say, like, look, I'm an adult, and this governance affects me. This is what I'm going to do, and these are the policies that I'm going to vote for to be represented by them. So I really think it's up to young people, the college students, to shape what we want our future to look like, because kind of like what Alyssa said, voting like among age groups, like old people vote a lot, like 65 up, like really high voter turnout. And then this like 18 to 29 age group, we have like extraordinary low voter turnout, which is just so counterintuitive, because the policies that are passed in the next few years are the ones that are going to affect us for a lifetime. So it's like, how are we going to kind of use our vote to shape policy and shape like what we want our future to look like?
Thank you. Francis, I like that notion right there at the end about how we use our voices to dictate policy and I guess shape what the future looks like. I have one final question for the three of you, in a similar vein to everything we've been saying about how voting lets us choose the future of the country. Francis, we'll start with you. Is it possible for the government's policies to be representative of the larger citizenry if there's no voting? What do you think?
Yeah, I do not think that we can have a representative democracy without voting. Just because by voting, you're putting people in power, you're giving politicians a job, and their job is to represent you, their constituency, and the whole, not only their base, but their whole, who they're representative of. So, I think without voting as being this first step of accountability, whether that's voting people in or voting people out, it's just very important that that's one mechanism in which we can hold politicians accountable to the needs of the American people, and to the Tennessee people, or to whatever Davidson County, whatever constituency you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I really think that without voting, like, people cannot have a voice. They can't really get their needs heard. It really does hold politicians accountable. I mean, you hope that politicians are in power because they actually want to help the people they represent, but I think voting also is another way just to make sure that, like, they're really being held accountable, because without actually responding to your constituency and to the people that you represent, there's no way you're going to get reelected. They're not going to be happy. They're going to find someone else who can actually represent them. So with voting, you're really able to hold the people you elect accountable and make sure that they're responding to your needs.
I think they both like summed up the importance of having the right to vote in a democracy. I mean, like the word accountable was used, and I really think that like best shapes up why the vote is so important, because without that, there's really no firm reason for representatives to listen to what people say and what they want and how their lives are affected by these policies. So.
Well, thank you all so very much for coming on the show today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and beliefs about voting. I really appreciate it. And all I can say is my absentee ballot is on its way, and we'll see when it gets here. Well, thank you all again very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Nolan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome to our first interlude. Let's begin unpacking some of the things that we've covered so far. So by talking about Hartsfield's Landing, by talking about the West Wing Special, and by interviewing those three students. So we'll start by looking at a Pew Research Center survey, a study from February of this year called Democratic Rights Popular Globally, but Commitment to Them Not Always Strong. According to the study, most Americans, quote unquote, believe that voting gives people like them some say about how the government runs things. 74% actually believe that. So just so you know, there are a lot of other countries also included in this study, and seeing as I'm really only talking about the US, I'm only showing you data pertaining to the US. If you're interested in seeing all 34 countries in the study, I encourage you to look up the study itself. So we can use this data that we've now collected by looking at the West Wing Special, by interviewing the students, by looking at this study, and try and answer our two questions. Is voting impactful and is voting important? Well, primarily, I think we can see that there's a resounding yes so far to the answer of is voting impactful? The students said that voting has a significant impact on the country's policies, and we can vote out representatives who don't deliver on the promises that they make to us. We can hold them true to their word. In fact, going back even a little further in our talk show, we can look at the West Wing Special. There's a running storyline through the episode, through Hartsfield's Landing, about how one average American family can voice policy desires directly to the Deputy Chief of Staff of President Bartlett's administration, directly to Josh Lyman. The Deputy Chief of Staff, in case you don't know, works directly under the Chief of Staff. And the Chief of Staff in the White House is the president's right-hand man. So we have this regular American family voicing their opinions about policy and how to steer the country directly to the Deputy Chief of Staff, all because the Deputy Chief of Staff wants them to vote for President Bartlett in an election. So voting quite clearly is depicted as being incredibly impactful. Voting gives this family an opportunity to voice policy desires to one of the men in charge. That's pretty crazy. Furthermore, we can even look at the existence of the West Wing Special as a statement about the perceived impact of voting. Aaron Sorkin and the cast of the West Wing wouldn't have come together to try and push people to the polls if voting didn't matter. The entire existence of the special assumes that voting makes a difference to policy. So it seems like we have a resounding yes to the question of, is voting impactful? So let's turn to our second question, is voting important? Well, remember, we defined importance as having effects beyond those of affecting policy. So I would argue that because voting got the West Wing cast back together to make a special, and I like the West Wing, yeah, voting's totally important. And moving past my personal preferences to a more serious study of voting, it seems like there's a potential importance to voting. For example, in the special, there's one clip right at the end where one girl stands up to cast her ballot, and someone narrating the events, the news coverage in the special, says this is her first election, and then everyone in the community goes, yay! The whole town of Hartsfield's Landing starts clapping for her. Hooray, it's her first election. So we can clearly see that there's a suggested importance of voting because voting, the act of it, brings the community together. So we seem to have a yes, voting is impactful, and voting is portrayed as being pretty important, and that's sort of a stretch, so let's call it a potential importance. So it's impactful, it might be important. Where do we go from here? Well, let's delve further into those two questions by seeing if reality measures up to the belief that voting is important and impactful. We're going to examine voting's role in shaping American policy. To that end, I interviewed political science professor Josh Clinton and political science professor Larry Bartels. Professor Clinton is a co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, the editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, and he specializes in elections and campaigns. Professor Bartels also is a co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, and he wrote 2 books related to this subject. He wrote Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government, and he wrote Unequal Democracy, The Political Economy of the New Gilded Age. Professor Bartels specializes in elections and campaigns, as well as representation. So let's check out the interview. We're joined today by 2 Vanderbilt political science professors, Professor Bartels and Professor Clinton. Thank you both for being with us today.
Hi, I'm Larry Bartels, professor in the political science department. Happy to be here. Hi, I'm Josh Clinton, professor of political science, also from Vanderbilt. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm also happy to be here, so I guess we make a perfect trio. We've spoken a little bit before in our prior interview and our interlude about voting and the impact that it can have on the country. Today, right now in this section, we're going to delve into that a little bit more. We'll begin with a relatively simple appearing question that has a relatively complex answer. Why do you think that we vote in the first place? Professor Clinton, maybe we could start with you, please.
Sure, I think there's lots of reasons why people vote. Some people think it's their civic duty to do so, perhaps because they're told at a very young age that it's the right thing to do. It's how you're a good citizen. Some might be trying to do so to try to make a change. They're not happy with what the status quo is giving them, and so they want to try to disrupt things to make the world better off for them. There's some work that suggests like voting is a habit. So whatever, that's not exactly clear what that means entirely, but like once you start voting, it's something that becomes something that you do in the future. There's a feeling about social pressure, right? If you're seeing everyone wearing the I voted sticker and you don't have one, that makes some people feel vulnerable and they want to go out to kind of get, so they can get a sticker as well. And so there's some pressure to kind of voting as well. So I think there's lots of different reasons that people decide to kind of go out to the ballot box and cast a vote.
Well, thank you. All I know is that I really hope that my absentee ballot comes with one of those Georgia Peach I voted stickers. Professor Bartels, what do you think? Why do you think we vote in the first place?
People have complicated ideas about politics and government as they do about many other things. On one hand, we tend to be very cynical about government, and if people are given a chance, they'll complain about how unresponsive elected officials are and how they're all crooked. On the other hand, in some ways, we're very idealistic about the democratic process and cling to the idea that participating in elections gives us, if not the only say, at least the last and most important say about what's going to happen in the country. I remember reading a political philosopher who was talking about how any form of government is dangerous because the government can make us do stuff that we don't want to do, or it can do things to us that are going to be harmful to us. And in a democracy, we can at least have the idea that we're ruling, maybe indirectly, but somehow ruling ourselves, and that makes it less scary, even if in fact we don't really have much in the way of direct control over what happens.
Why do you think that we vote one way or another? So after we've accepted the fact that people vote, what pulls us towards one party or one candidate?
The most important thing in terms of predicting any individual's voting behavior is their long-term attachment to one party or the other. That's been true for a long time in the US, but even more recently as the polarization between the parties has increased, the proportion of the electorate that have strong interests on one side or the other of the partisan divide has increased. And so if you guess that a Democrat is going to vote for any Democratic candidate and a Republican is going to vote for any Republican candidate in the current environment, you'll be right about 90% of the time. If you think about the difference between elections, given the partisan balance at any given moment, the most important factor is people's perceptions of the condition of the country. So if you look, for example, at whether the economy is in a boom or a bust in the months leading up to the election, that's a pretty good predictor of whether the incumbent party's support is going to go up or down from the last election.
I'm just kind of building on the excellent points that Professor Bartels made. There's a lot of work about socialization, about like where you get your partisanship. Like some of that, we get a lot of that from the context and the environment that we're grown up with, and that kind of, if you go to school and who you hang out with, and that kind of really shapes your views and how you think about Democrats and Republicans, that can push you towards one side or the other. And then also kind of when you come to age in some sense. So there's been some work that, young people, your first experience with politics is dependent upon the current context that you have. Right? So now when you're thinking about Republican Party, you're thinking about President Trump, right? Which is different than someone coming to age in the 1980s, right? Or the 1970s, the 60s, So like that also has really powerful and long lasting effects on how people identify with one particular party or the other, and that can be enduring across their lifetime. And so, things like that, like what does a condition look like when you become of age, or kind of when you become aware of politics, can have long-lasting effects in terms of how you identify with the Democrat or Republican.
So, Professor Clinton, as we go through that growing process then and sort of come into the world, it sounds like we might also come into different political beliefs than the ones to which we were originally exposed. So in that light, do you think that people have preferences over what policies are passed based on the virtues of the policies themselves, based on the virtues of the parties that are proposing the policies? What might cause someone to lead one way or another on policy issues?
Well, I think there's lots of different considerations, right? So I think people all will frequently express they have these particular views towards a particular policy, right? And either because of their experience or kind of their background or what they encounter in the world about what their priorities are. And so they'll express the priorities for policy, but I think it also, they sometimes take a lot of the policies up from elite cues, right? And so once identifies a Democrat or Republican, given the policy making is this iterative process, sometimes I will take a new policy, not because I come to it by some, magical process, but yet I hear my side talking about this policy. Oh, that's my policy. That's what I, ought to support of. And so there's a lot of, learning or cue taking from partisan elites. So once you sort into your Democrat versus Republican party, right, a lot of the policy views that you have, right, they're going to be shaped by who the leaders of your parties are and kind of what issues that what they're talking about. And so, which comes first, policy versus party, right? That's harder to say, but because partisanship is more broadly and more encompassing and, across a lot of different issues, I think typically think that partisanship is much more a powerful predictor of lots of views than particular policy views.
Thank you. Professor Bartels, what do you think?
I think it's helpful to think about the relationship in just the way Professor Clinton suggested, that people have more or less strong views about a few specific issues that may drive them to associate themselves with one party or the other, but more often they're likely to be forming their policy views insofar as they have them on the basis of their partisan attachments and the cues that they're getting from political leaders that they respect. I think a useful example here is the case of abortion. People think of abortion as maybe the most fundamental political issue, and one where people's views are strongly grounded in moral convictions and religious convictions for some people. There was a study that followed the same people over a 15-year period from the early 1980s to the late 1990s and looked at the relationship between their views about abortion and their views about partisanship to see how they changed and which seemed to be affecting the other. And on average for women, by a slight amount, when their view about abortion conflicted with their partisanship, they were more likely to change their partisanship to bring it into line with their view about abortion. For men, the opposite was true. They were more likely to change their view about abortion to bring it into line with their partisanship. And that's consistent with the idea that on average, men probably care less about abortion as an issue. And so they're more willing to take advice from political leaders in order to produce consistency between their view on that specific issue and their overall partisanship. And for most people, that process is working to a greater or lesser degree on different issues. So people who are politically active and engaged and pay a lot of attention to politics are the ones who are most likely to have consistent cookie cutter positions on all kinds of issues, not because there's any logical necessity that issue positions fit together in that way, but just because they've taken on board basically the entire package that their party is trying to sell. And people who are less interested in politics and pay less attention to the news have more diverse policy preferences because they don't feel quite the same pressure toward consistency to adopt views that are consistent with their partisanship.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So in that context then, in that relationship between policy and partisanship. It sounds like some people might be pulled to vote based on partisanship, but some people might based on policy. So it's an interesting relationship that gets to form. Do you think, Professor Bartels, that there is a relationship then between voting and what policies are passed, in the sense of, if I want a policy passed, I vote one way, or I vote one way and then I have a certain policy passed? So either a proactive or retroactive way of passing policies.
Well, if people vote for one side or the other, they're voting for a policy package. They may not know all the details and they may not approve of their party's position on every issue, but in a sense, they're casting votes that are related to issue preferences. And if you ask them why they're voting the way they are, they're much more likely to say that, you know, my favorite candidate has this position that I approve of on some high-sounding policy issue, than to say, you know, I like him because he speaks up for white people, or I like her because she's good looking, or I voted for this person because they share my ethnic identity, or I always vote for the Republican regardless of who it is because that's the simplest thing to do. So it's a way that people rationalize their choices, but as best we can tell, it's relatively rare for specific issue positions to determine the way people vote in a particular election. After the fact, they then make some judgment about how the incumbents have done, how the country is going, whether things seem to be going well or badly, and make some judgment about the success or failure of whatever it was that was being tried. That also sometimes gets translated in terms of policy preferences and specific things that the president should have done that he didn't do, or shouldn't have done that he did do. But often, again, it's a deeper motivation is simply a sense that people have of how well or badly things are going.
Thank you. Professor Clinton, I'll slightly alter the question as we pop over to you. Does voting for one party guarantee any sort of policy will be passed or torn down? And then if it doesn't, what do we do when administrations or when representatives' terms don't necessarily live up to what we think they will?
Well, they'll never live up to what you expect them if you go in to think they'll do. So that's like, it's good to have that in your brain when you go in the ballot box. Like if you're expecting them, I'm going to pull this lever, policy is going to happen. Like if that's your expectation, it's not going to happen. So you just like, you know, excise that whole brain synapses from the calculation. But what I think, building on what Professor Bartels said, like, you know, voting does have policy impacts, right? So if you want to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, you should not vote for a Democrat, because that's not going to happen, right? And so like there are certain, you know, but if you want to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, if you vote for the Republicans, it doesn't guarantee it's going to happen either, right? And so you can rule out that policy change will never happen of a particular sort, depending on which party gets elected. But even if your side wins that is consistent with your policy views, there's not a guarantee that that's going to happen. So, for example, in 2016, the Republicans won the House, the Senate, and the presidency, but yet we still have the Affordable Care Act. When the Democrats won in 2008, the House, the Senate, and the presidency, people thought that, you know, there's going to be the massive healthcare reform. And sure enough, there was healthcare reform. The Affordable Care Act was an important reform in that respects, but it's not exactly the policies that I think any Democrats were really pushing for, especially the progressive sides. I mean, they ended up with making compromises because of the death of Senator Kennedy and the election of Senator Scott Brown. And so they had to do all this kind of not backroom, but kind of legislative machinery to kind of enact the version that was passed by the Senate and not what the House Democrats and Speaker Pelosi were really pushing for. And so I think there is a relationship to some extent, but again, it's driven largely by partisanship. Right? So if your side wins, there's a chance that you may get your policy, right? Whereas if the other side wins, there's probably no chance that you get your policy. So that's a very crude mapping that I think, you know, you can have the expectation of. But like if you think that I'm going to vote for this, then, so if Vice President Biden wins, that means we're going to have a Green New Deal. We're going to have all this, you know, student loans being forgiven. Like everything they're talking about is going to happen. Like, no way. It's just, you know, that's just not how things work. There's a very strong bias towards the status quo in the United States, and it's intentionally very hard to kind of make dramatic policy changes especially depending on what the policy is. And so I think there's relationship there, but it's not as direct as what people think. Now, that said, there is a relationship in the sense that if you don't, that representatives and elected officials do vote, right? They do try to think about whether or not they're going to get reelected based on the decisions that they make. So if people aren't voting, right, and if they know they're not going to vote, then their views probably aren't relevant at all, right? That's not to say that if you vote, your views are relevant, but if you don't vote, your views are certainly not relevant, right? And so we often talk about young people not voting at a very high rates. And so how come the policy is all skewed towards older people? And part of that is because politicians know that you have lots of, we've been trying to rock the vote for a long, long time, even when I was young, right? But for whatever reason, young people don't turn out at the same rate. And that's going to have consequences for who politicians have incentives to listen to about their views, even if they are well articulated and they have policy views.
I have one final question for both of you. To what extent might voting actually lead directly toward a policy? In the sense that we don't vote on policies in a direct democracy, but we have a representative democracy. So I guess what I'm really asking is, to what extent do representatives take to heart the wishes of their constituents when they go and vote on these policies?
Yes, I think, there's been some good work thinking about how do elected officials think about public opinion, right? And so they need to think about not only what views have been explicitly expressed about a particular policy, but then also what views haven't been expressed, right? And then, so they have to think about what the public is active and what public is, is attentive to what's going on, and what does the inattentive public also think about the issue. But then also, come election day, if it's 2 years down the road, if you're senator, it's 6 years down the road, what's the likelihood that this issue is going to be pivotal, right, for how the voters are going to vote or not, and what other considerations they're going to have. And also, just the policymaking process is so diffuse that it's very hard, right, to blame a particular legislator for their particular actions. So instead, what we typically see, especially nowadays, is kind of the role of the partisanship, right? And so, you see a lot of Republicans and Democrats who are, they're being tied to their parties, independent of what they actually did in office. The same thing happened in 2010. The same thing is happening now. And so, I think it's a very complicated, relationship to kind of think about that. Representatives are trying to think about what they need to do to get elected and reelected. And certainly they need to get a majority of votes in their district to do so. But how critical any particular policy is towards that end is kind of less clear. Now, that said, if the part of a particular electorate's not voting at all, then they have no chance of having any kind of influence. So it's a necessary condition to have influence to vote, but I don't think it's sufficient. It's complicated.
I think there are two ways to interpret your question. One is to ask, does the election outcome send a signal to elected officials about policies? I think there the answer is mostly no, simply because the vote is such a blunt instrument for communicating. People could have any of a million different things motivating their decision to vote one way or the other, as we've already discussed. And so I think politicians mostly don't interpret the election outcome as evidence about preferences on any specific issue. If they want that, they can go to opinion polls to get a sense of what people think about particular issues. The other way to think about the question is, does the election outcome actually produce significant differences in policy? And there, I think the answer is clearly yes. When I was coming up in the middle of the 20th century, there was a lot of complaint about how the parties were so similar that it didn't make any difference who you voted for. George Wallace, who was a famous kind of populist politician, said there isn't a dime's worth of difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. And some people, I think, still voice that kind of cynicism, but in the current environment, there's a whole lot of difference between the Democrats and Republicans. So in that sense, it's certainly a meaningful policy choice, not necessarily on every issue and not to the extent that they promise in their platforms, but in terms of the overall policy direction of the country, it makes a huge difference whether the president and whether the members of Congress are Republicans or Democrats.
That's really interesting. So how we vote can lead to certain policies, but might not necessarily lead to certain policies being taken down. Yet how we vote is very impactful for general directions of the country, even though we don't necessarily have any guarantees because things can shift and change during terms. Thank you both so very much for coming on the show today. I appreciate your time and learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's take a quick check-in. Where does this leave us? So according to the students and what we can derive and what we can understand from looking at the Pew study, voting lets our voices be heard about desired policies, and we can vote out the people who don't do what we want them to do. We have a way of holding representatives accountable by virtue of being able to vote them out of office. According to Professors Bartels and Clinton, though, voting isn't necessarily as straightforward as it might seem. Primarily, we can look at policy changes. Voting has the potential to make change through policy, but it doesn't actually guarantee anything. This is a watered down version, essentially, of what the students suggested. Then we can look at what happens if you don't vote and how that can manifest in representatives fighting for policy changes. Let's say that you are a non-voter. Representatives want to get reelected. So if you aren't someone who will help them get reelected, they probably won't step up to bat to fight for the things that are important to you. If you won't help them, they might not necessarily help you. This pretty much says yes to the students. Here we have a nice harmony between the professors and the students. However, all of this is really built on one key assumption. It's built on the assumption that the way we vote is a sign of our policy preferences, right? If I vote one way, but that isn't a sign of my policy preferences, then a representative could do whatever he or she wants to do, and it might not necessarily be against my policy preferences as manifested through my vote, because voting doesn't really manifest my policy preferences, right? According to Professors Clinton and Bartels in their interview, we said that voting is a blunt instrument, quote unquote. This actually says no to the students. The students said that voting is how we have our voices heard about what policies are passed in the country, yet now we're beginning to see that voting isn't actually an inherent statement about policy preferences. And on another note, our policy preferences can be driven by our experiences, our backgrounds, or our priorities, as the professors stated, or we can have our policy preferences come from the elite members of our parties. We can take cues from partisan elites. This isn't as relevant right now, yet in a few moments after we interview our next guest, after I interview Professor Murray, we'll see why the role of elites in politics becomes of increasing importance. So this interview really leaves us with a gap. What stands in the way of voting dictating policy? Why does voting lead only to the possibility, the chance of policy being enacted, rather than a guarantee of policy being enacted? We have an option, but it won't necessarily come to fruition. Why do we have this gap? In addition to that bigger question, we have almost what I would consider something of a smaller question. Do we really vote representatives out of office as much as the students said that we do? Those are two questions that we'll delve into in a moment through my next interview. Before we get there, though, I'd like to have a super quick check-in about our two big guiding questions for today's talk show: impact and importance when it comes to voting. This interview with Professors Clinton and Bartels suggests a potentially diminished impact of voting, right? Voting doesn't necessarily achieve all that we think it does by virtue of not being a clear-cut, direct route to policy changes. By virtue of voting in a representative democracy, actually, we already have a built-in middleman. I don't get to vote on the policies that I want enacted like I would in a direct democracy. I get to vote on representatives. So what representatives do is sort of the question. So the impact of voting is somewhat diminished as a result of this. There's a gap between voting and voters' policy preferences and what's actually enacted by representatives. However, we haven't yet discovered why the gap exists. We have to answer those two aforementioned questions, we just have to answer all of those aforementioned questions about the gap between voting and preferences and what actually happens, why there's a chance of a policy but not a guarantee. We have to answer those questions so that we can truly understand what's going on in our political system. And as for the second guiding question, importance, that hasn't really changed as a result of this interview. We still have a potential importance for voting, again, according to our definition of importance. So now we're going to delve into those questions with political sociologist and Vanderbilt sociology professor Josh Murray. Professor Murray's research focuses on political and economic sociology as well as social movements. Professor Murray is a recipient of a major grant from Vanderbilt University, which allowed him to study the political donations of corporate directors and political action committees, and he's currently writing a book called The Evolution of Corporate Elite Politics. As you'll see in just a moment, Professor Murray offers an eye-opening perspective on policy matters. Professor Murray, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm very excited to have you as a guest.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll begin with a quick zoomed out-ish question about voting. The two professors left us with a possibility of voting shaping policy and leading to change, but there's no real guarantee there. Why can't policies be guaranteed?
So the largest reason is that the people who both make our policies and especially enact our policies are not actually elected. So it's the biggest kind of difference between kind of directly translating the voters' preferences into policy. Now, who makes those becomes important, right? So our first kind of problem we have, if we want to frame it, is that if we assume like democracy, that we want voters' preferences to translate into policy, and we see this as a problem, is that it costs an incredible amount of money to run a campaign. And it takes a lot of time to raise money. And so there's a model of raising money would be the Bernie Sanders model. I reach out to millions and millions of people for $27 and I raise hundreds of millions of dollars through that. That's a lot of time and effort to continually reach out to people. Every single campaign that you have, every incumbency, trying to reach out and get new people to give you money. A quicker way that politicians have discovered is you find really wealthy people and you hold a fundraiser and they give you the money you need to run in a couple of fundraisers, but also you start relationships with those wealthy people and they will continually give you money to run over and over again. They're on your side now, you can count on them. Now there's lots of research into this campaign donations and it's very mixed on if it affects policy, in the sense that most research shows not a big effect on votes. So if you look at who gets the most money from oil, are they worse environmentally than ones who get the least? Yes, but they were before. So the idea is oil companies give to people that are going to support environmental deregulation, but not that someone that was an environmentalist before gets money from oil and now all of a sudden is against regulation. But what we know money does is it buys access. And there's lots of studies into this that show that the amount of donations buys access, experimental studies and other studies, that if I'm a big donor and I call, you're the senator, you're going to take my call. And so I have access to you and my lobbyists have access. So wealthy people also spend, especially corporations and corporate elites, spend a lot of money on lobbyists, and those lobbyists get to talk to the people writing the bills. So your first part is there's a large influence. If I'm in your ear talking to you, I'm going to influence the way the bill is shaped. Now there's an extra part here, which is our elected representatives have to craft policy on a wide range of issues, right? From immigration to military to healthcare, and there's no way they're an expert on all of those, if they're an expert on any of them. Lobbyists and think tanks, ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council, but also the Business Roundtable, the Business Council. There's these corporate funded places that bring together corporate elites, legislators, and expert academics who are handpicked by the wealthy to craft legislation. So in a large sense, legislation isn't really even written by the people we elect. They're written by these outside people hired by wealthy people, and then that's put in place. Once legislation is passed, then how is it enacted? Well, if it's environmental legislation, it's the Environmental Protection Agency. We don't vote on who heads the Environmental Protection Agency. We don't vote on who heads the SEC. Who heads it tends to be a representative from industry, another wealthy corporate elite that is selected oftentimes. Some of my new research that I've been doing there are people that also give money. So there's that tie to the campaign. So while campaign donations may not influence votes, it influences all of this background of policymaking. And the outcome of this is that there's no consistent tie between the will of the voters and the actual policy that comes out, right? Because you don't have that direct connection that I vote you in, you make the policy. I vote you in, but then all these people that are giving you money make the policy. And those are the same people kind of donating and making the policy regardless of who I vote in. And so what we see, there was a recent, not as recent anymore, I believe it was 2014, study out of Princeton, I think Northwestern, that looked at like 1,700 outcomes of bills from 1980 to 2007, I want to say. Could be off on the year, but somewhere around there, right? So a long period of time, many, many outcomes. And they picked bills that matched up with polls that were taken for preferences. And they look at preferences of the top 10% in income, everybody else, business groups, and then groups that are not business groups, so like labor groups or Planned Parenthood. And what they find essentially is the wealthy and business groups drive policy. So to the extent that voters get what they want, it's when they happen to agree with the wealthy. And that's consistent with this view of why that happens, is this view that it's not who we elect that's really making and enacting policy, but this layer of elites that are appointed, of wealthy corporate elites that are appointed and have kind of their influence in through giving donations and lobbying.
Thank you. That's very interesting. This certainly contrasts with what it appears many people tend to think about voting, how it's a direct line to change in society. With these wealthy elites that have so much influence in policy, it's really interesting to think about how today what remains true is what was true at the foundations of the country, in that we can look back at things like the Constitutional Convention, and we can even see that the people there were these wealthy, landowning white men who, although let's emphasize the wealthy part, the elites, these elite people who were driving policy and declaring independence and forming the country. And today that seems like it holds true. We have these wealthy people who get to drive policy. Why hasn't that changed in the many years that America has been around?
Well, so part of it is just the advantage that wealth gives in every avenue of power, right? So to the extent that, I mean, right now is a really good example to me. You can have whatever one's view of Donald Trump is, right? The kind of general cultural feeling now is that this election is the most important thing in the world and that voting is going to change things. And whatever you're feeling about this election, that has ramifications outside of it, because I can remember 2016 being framed that way and 2012 being framed that way. And every election is framed as the election that's so important and you have to vote and it's going to change things. And so underlying that is the idea that voting is the ultimate power to shape policy, right? That if you vote for the wrong person, policy is going to be vastly different. And that cultural message does not come out of nowhere, right? If we look at where are all the get out the vote things coming from, it's funded by major corporations. Major corporations have these things out. It's celebrities that make a lot of money. And so the ability to influence cultural messages is an ability to get people to believe things about power that serve the interests of those in power. And so that's part of it, right? If you poll the American public, they think overwhelmingly that Congress and the president don't represent regular people's interests and they represent special interests. They think overwhelmingly that the wealthy and corporations have undue influence. So regular people think that, yet there's still this cultural belief that flies in the face of what they think, right? So there's this weird contradiction. That is what happens when you have kind of control over cultural messages, right? An ability to just inundate people with messages. Even what you know starts to be questioned, right? It's also why we have low rates of participation. So we're kind of among wealthy countries, we have among the lowest rates of voting. And a lot of people often attribute that to lack of knowledge, ignorance. We need to, educate people, and other people attribute it to repression, make it very hard to vote. And those things are not, those exist, but polls of non-voters consistently find that the vast majority of non-voters don't report that they can't vote and they want to. They report that essentially they don't see it as worth it. They either don't see the candidates as being really different, or they don't like either candidate, so they don't want to vote. They don't think that their vote matters. Or they report things like they had something else to do at the time. But I think that's an interesting one, because if you thought something was the most important thing, you probably would prioritize it. So the fact that you're reporting that you're prioritizing other things and you're just like, I didn't really have time for it, suggests you don't think it's that important. And so one way to view that is they're ignorant and we need to tell them how important voting is. But kind of the perspective I'm putting is perhaps they understand the system better than we think. That they understand, at the end of the day, it doesn't have a direct line to policy. And it tends to be poor people, the people that have policy against them the most, and that they've lived through multiple administrations and different votes and not seen a big difference and decided it's not worth their time. But so what we end up with if people don't see another avenue is apathy, right? So you either have people that just, they can't be apathetic, so they convince themselves it matters and they play the game, or you have people that say, well, nothing matters, who cares? And so there's an interesting question of, has it not changed because there is no other avenue of power, or is it because people have kind of forgotten what other avenues of power there have been in the past?
On that note then, about the powerful elites being gatekeepers of policy, regular citizens obviously can't control who gets to fill that role. We can control who gets to interact with them because we get to elect our representatives. So with these elites being the gatekeepers of policy, they get to choose what policies end up ultimately being successful or ultimately dying in the process of trying to be passed. So earlier in the interview with Frances, Cassidy, and Alyssa, we said that when policies that we want don't get passed, so when representatives don't live up for our expectations for them, we can vote them out, and we approach it as this very general, easy thing to do. To what extent does that actually happen?
Right. So in a functioning democracy, you would assume that would be how it works, that either the people you vote for represent your interests or they get voted out. And that would be the pressure that causes them most of the time to represent your interests, that they want to stay in office and they know if they don't, oh, look, at that guy didn't do it and he got voted out. In practice, our incumbency rates at the low end are 80% and at the high end are 98%, and usually hover above 90%, which is to say that on average, over 90% of people rerunning for office win again. And this is for a number of reasons. There's an advantage to being an incumbent in terms of raising money, that people that give money already know that they know you and they're willing. You already have a network of people to give you money. You don't have to start over with that. There's also the thing that the wealthy like to give to incumbents, because they know incumbents are more likely to win. They want to give them money so that they have access to who's likely to win, but that extra money makes them even more likely to win. And the reason they're more likely to win, even if you control for money, is just name recognition and change. So the idea of the devil you know is better than the devil you don't really has something to do with our incumbency rate, that a lot of people don't really trust that new politicians are going to be any better. They don't know. And when they don't know, they'll just stick with what they have, right? And so that then interacts with the wealthy saying, we know that happens, then we're just going to give even more money to them. That it's really hard to get incumbents out. But that frees incumbents. Then if incumbents are going to get reelected 90% of the time or more, they don't have the same pressure to represent our interests, right? So then there's a new equation for them, which is, I'm probably going to get reelected regardless. What do I have to worry about? I have to worry about raising money, because money does matter in terms of getting reelected. So I have to make my donors happy. I have to worry about what's going to happen after I leave office. So an interesting thing happens if you chart members of Congress's careers after they leave office, is many of them become lobbyists for corporations and make millions of dollars, or get put on the boards of companies and make millions of dollars, more money than they make as Congress people. Barney Frank, who wrote Frank Dodd Regulating the Banks and was this kind of progressive person that was going to regulate the banks, when he left office, was given a seat as vice president of a bank, and immediately after that started lobbying against putting Glass-Steagall back in place and regulating banks and saying that banks are a problem. So we see, right, like if you keep them happy, there's a spot for you. So one thought would be people that are nice to them get that job and people that aren't don't. But I think that has a chilling effect on the behavior of legislators. If I don't have to worry about being voted out by voters, I have to worry about when I do leave here, do I have somewhere where do I have a soft landing? And I don't want to make these wealthy interests too angry. I might not have, there may be differing levels of how much I serve them, but there's going to be an outer reach to where I'm willing to go, because I want them to at least know that I'm somewhat friendly so that I have that soft landing. And all of that acts to make it so that it matters less than you would think who you elect. Now, there's other reasons for that. You could also just do right. So it matters less who you elect because we don't unelect people. That was your question, the incumbency rate. And that has ramifications for people's calculations, right? It's important beyond just that we don't kick people out, but also that they know we don't kick people out, and that affects their calculations. And that's to say, if your prior interviewees were right, then they would be right about a lot of their other assumptions. So if the incumbency rate was 20%, one thing I would expect to happen really quickly is voters' preferences would translate into policy more and the incumbency rate would rise. So it's important that it's not, right? It's important that it's not 20%. It's important that we don't kick people out. Well, think about the narrative around Obamacare. So when Obama was elected, he wanted to put forward healthcare. And there's long been a debate since the 70s about whether we should have universal healthcare like other countries or some other form of market care, how we would put this into place. When Obama came in, his idea was the Clinton healthcare plan went down because they didn't work with healthcare companies. So he got healthcare lobbyists to help him write the bill. And so, of course, in their version of the bill, there's never any universal aspect. There's no public option. They take that out because a public option starts to hurt the market for healthcare companies, right? If I don't like what you're charging me, I just go to the public option. That's no good for them, so they don't want that. It went through, they fought, they passed the bill. Now, the narrative around that is that's all he could have done because Republicans would never vote for a public option. But what's missing is the reality of that narrative that when he passed Obamacare, the Democrats had control of the House and the Senate. So if Democrats as a party were really for the most progressive version of guaranteeing healthcare to everybody, it would have just passed. And at the very least, it would have been a debate about it, that Obama would have put that forward, and then maybe it loses, maybe there's centrist Democrats, but there was never a debate. That was the most left thing they pushed and the furthest left they could go. So a question is that because they're not really left and we don't have a left party? Sure, but part of it is because the interests involved in crafting the legislation, that's the limit of where they'll go. They don't want universal healthcare because that kills the market on healthcare companies. Even if you get control of everything with your party, it guarantees no sort of outcome. Now, another view of that would be that universal healthcare is not popular, but polls have shown that it's incredibly popular now, but also all the way going back. So, there's a lot of credit given to Bernie Sanders for making it popular. But if you go back to the 90s, if you asked it in a certain way, if you asked people, is government healthcare good? They would say no. But if you said, do you think that the government should guarantee the right of healthcare to all people? It's consistently polled over 70% for decades and decades. So it becomes this interesting thing of why is a popular policy with the party that says they're for that in power of everything not passing? And it takes that deeper look of how policy is crafted and where it goes. But it also suggests to us that there are limits on what politicians can do when there's those gatekeepers there. So an interesting mental experiment for anyone that thinks that voting is kind of the primary power that you could, is to imagine an extreme. Either if you're right wing, imagine libertarian. Imagine that somehow Ron Paul won the presidency, Rand Paul won the vice presidency, and the Senate was taken over by libertarians. Do you think that they could get rid of the central bank? On the other side, imagine Bernie Sanders wins, AOC wins, socialists, not even just progressive Democrats, people that call themselves socialists win. Do you think that we would be able to nationalize banks? That tells you what you think of the power of voting. My hunch would be, given the power structure we have now, no. Right? Now, of course, if you change society to where you could vote them in, that's different. But just imagine I could snap my fingers. We have the same society, but they're in power. I think that there are barriers to passing policies that are not popular with rich people. One of those is disinvestment. So in Washington, D.C., the legislature passed a bill for a living wage. And the mayor of DC is a Democrat. So we should be good here. The mayor of DC vetoed it. And the reason the mayor of DC vetoed it was that retailers went to the mayor and told them, if you pass this, we're going to close our shops down and leave. And the calculation was this would be devastating to the economy of DC. It would lose jobs. It's not worth it. So there is a power that wealth has beyond electoral politics to also disrupt, and it acts as a barrier, right? We'll stop giving you money. We'll have our media companies drag you through the mud so that you don't get reelected. We'll pull our investments out. And those are things that no matter who you elect, they have to face.
It seems like there certainly are discrepancies between what we think about voting and what actually happens with voting.
The more unequal our societies become economically, regionally, racially, etc., the more representative democracy just can't work very well. That's a problem, right? And so in that sense, the more we reduce inequality, that enhances democracy, in my opinion, period, that we want to reduce inequality. Now, on top of that, then once inequality is reduced, there's also just, are there things that benefit everybody? Are there things that we could see would benefit everybody? And to the extent that we're trying to work on those, that's good. So if you poll Americans, everybody thinks our healthcare system is broken, including Republicans. We just disagree on how to fix it. That's great. That's a democratic problem. Until Obamacare, we hadn't even acted to try to fix it. So up until then, democracy was clearly not functioning. Obamacare, you could critique from a certain perspective, but at least that is an element of trying to fix it. And that's somewhat democratic. People want it fixed, you tried to fix it, right? We can hole into things of why things work the way they did and where that's not democratic, but that's a democratic process. But like gun control, overwhelmingly 90+% of people want to do something on gun control. People disagree on how far to go, where to go, what. That's a democratic problem. We don't do anything. Nothing's being passed. Enhancing democracy is always something where things that everyone agrees would benefit us, we try to work to fix, and that there's not such a difference in standards of living that there can be policies that will hurt one group while they help the other group. So we try to reduce inequality and we try to pass the will of the people.
So we're talking about gun control, right? As an example, it seems like there are a lot of people who know that the NRA can play a very large role in what happens with gun control policy, and that it seems like there are a lot of people who might want that role to be changed, which I think ties back, right, with everything about power and getting what you want accomplished, and ties back to the more elite portion of society having power over the policy that's passed. How do we reconcile that notion? So this one specific example of elites having a power over policy, how do we reconcile us recognizing that power, yet still believing that voting can truly change society? Like, we fully acknowledge this discrepancy, yet we continue to believe that we can turn everything on its head.
Right. So in that case, I think it's having that instance of this isolated from the larger structure that it's a part of. So if you only have that instance, then you kind of see that the gun lobby mostly gives money to Republicans with a few kind of Democrats in red states. So you could get the view that if we could vote Republicans out would be good, and we just need as a kind of litmus test of Democrats, do you take money from the gun lobby? What's your record on guns? And if we could get the right type of Democrat in, we would pass this. Now, if you see it as part of a larger structure, you see that the gun lobby is a lobby of gun manufacturers that are tied into a corporate elite structure where they share board members and banks have investments in them, that they're not isolated from the people that fund the rest of the campaign. So the right type of Democrat is also a Democrat that gets money from many of these same people, even if it's indirectly, if it's, I get money from Citibank, who has major investments in this gun manufacturer. I think that that perspective can help in understanding a politics where politicians aren't really worried about being voted out by voters and are really worried more about the wealthy behind the scenes, is that Democrats have a base that they need to speak to, and Republicans have a base they need to speak to. And it's in the interest of the entire system that those bases believe that if they could just get their party in charge, their preferences would go. And the only thing stopping them is this bad party on the other side. And so if there's something that everybody wants, which is gun control, Republicans need to convince their base that what they want to do is further than what their base wants, and they're protecting that. And otherwise they do something sensible, right? So they'll propose their own gun control laws, but that don't go as far as Democrats want. So Democrats won't agree. And then they could say to their base, we're trying to pass what you want. They don't, these are just these evil socialists. Democrats on the other side will say that Republicans are getting all this money and they stop it. A kind of thought experiment would be, what if you voted out all those Republicans and you had Democrats that didn't get money from the gun lobby? Would all of a sudden we see this pass? If that's the case, then voting matters a great deal on this issue. And it really is just the gun lobby. Now, it's not impossible that it's the case. It's possible that certain policies are harder to pass and are of more interest to the wealthy, and other ones are more groups of wealthy that you could defeat, right? It doesn't all have to work this way. But it's also possible that when that happens, all of a sudden there'd be a set of Democrats who would find something wrong with it and still not vote for it. And they'd have some reason for it, but that it would somehow never pass. And the thing that makes me think about researchers taking this more seriously, which nobody does yet at all, partially because it's really hard to measure, but it's thinking about Republicans running on repealing Obamacare. For years and years and years and years and years, that was the central thing. Obamacare is terrible, and they're going to repeal it. And they had a majority of the Supreme Court, and they controlled the House, Congress, they controlled the whole Congress and the presidency. So you think like, okay, well, that's it. One way or the other, Obamacare is going down. And when it came to the vote, there was always just enough Republicans against a specific bill that it never passes. Now, maybe that's just happenstance and they're just bad at what they're doing, but maybe because the healthcare industry actually wrote Obamacare and they know that there's a desire for universal healthcare, they don't want to repeal it and open the door to people demanding something that they don't want. They want it to stay in. And that Republicans speaking about repealing it is just speaking to their base and dividing. When push comes to shove, they have to find some way not to actually repeal what the elites want. So most Republicans will vote to repeal it to keep their base happy. But on one bill, John McCain won't. And on the next bill, Susan Collins won't. There'll always be one. And they can say to their base, look, I'm for repealing it. It was just this bill had this specific problem. On the next bill, McCain gets to vote to repeal it and someone else takes the bullet. And they get to keep the kayfabe for the Republicans alive that they really represent what they want, which is not having this health care bill that they've convinced them is, an affront to their freedom, while actually keeping the interest. We also see this in California. They passed a universal health care bill, and the Speaker of the House in California's Congress wouldn't let it come to the floor. That was a Democrat. So there's an interesting pattern that oftentimes there's a narrative that it's the other party stopping us, but occasionally that falls apart and you still don't see these things pass that are against the interests of the wealthy. That it's necessary that the government has legitimacy and that we believe that this is a democracy and we vote, because if we don't, we might start searching for other forms of power that would activate our vote. And for people that want their policies to pass, they don't want that, right? So they have to have us believe it's legitimate. And so there's a bit of acting that goes on. But if you really follow policies and say, well, if the narrative on this one is true, then if this happens, that should happen, you'll find eventually that thing happens and then it doesn't follow. Then you have, right? Like if you really follow things and draw hypotheses, you start to see that it just doesn't work the way that we think it works.
Thank you. On that note, I have, I think, one final question. Does voting necessarily make governmental policy representative of the larger citizenry?
Yeah. No. So I think that a better view, a political science view of this is pluralism, right? Which is one that sociologists often kind of attack. But there's an element in that that's really good, which is that it's not really about votes and individual votes, but about interest groups. And interest groups can vote, but they also lobby. And they also take other actions. And to the extent that your interest group can ally with other interest groups to kind of have the majority of leverage, whether that's in voting or lobbying or whatever, you can get your things passed. The attack from people in my field on that is that it usually underplays the extent to which business interest groups really align into very large groups of elites that are seem impossible to defeat. That interest group thing all of a sudden matters a great deal, right? If different groups of workers and non-elites are able to come together and use their leverage as workers and in society to get the wealthy business groups to kind of remove themselves as barriers, all of a sudden now those groups voting and lobbying and doing other things in the system work because there's not the barrier. So that's essentially my theory of power, why I don't kind of fall into despair and say, there's no point to anything, right? With my kind of negative view of the electoral system is I think that there's great power outside of the electoral system and social movements that can lead to social change on its own, but they can also influence the electoral system so that you can have politicians that are friendly to what you want and give them the room to actually operate and do things. If things are allowed to get too bad, then people might actually start to search for their own power and start to revolt. And they know they'll lose that battle in the street. So there is an interest among elites to not ever get to that battle in the street. And so when there's a threat, you can get real things passed, right? So Obamacare passes, and for all its problems, it's better than what we had before, which was nothing. It passes because there was pressure to pass something that would make people stop agitating for universal health care, but also give them a weapon against it. So Bernie Sanders comes along after and says Medicare for all. What's the strategy Democrats use to fight that? You want to repeal Obamacare. We can't go for Medicare for all. We have to defend this thing from Republicans. And so it's a useful thing to get in place. That's not an accident, right? They knew that there was agitation for this before Bernie, and they needed a concession. And so, it's a give or take. The concessions both limit your ability to push things fully in kind of where the populace wants it, but it is also an improvement over what you have. And I think from my perspective, the important thing is realizing that that improvement only comes with leverage outside the electoral system. So it's not voting in different people that gets these things passed. It is first having that pressure that gets elites that can block things to say, we're not going to block this. You could actually pass something.
That's really interesting. Well, thank you, Professor Murray. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. This is weird to think about how voting isn't necessarily all that we think it can be, yet there's still a little inkling of hope. We'll unpack that in a few moments, but Professor Murray, thank you.
It's not as important as you think, but it's still important, right? It's not something to say, well, don't do it at all. But it's just much more complex. It's a much more complex process than we're led to imagine. And really what it says is that politics is just more than voting. It's not that it's not voting, it's much more, which, is also hard. It takes more engagement than just a ballot box.
I feel my brain stretching. Thank you, Professor Murray.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me on.
Let's check back in. Where does all of this leave us? Well, it looks like that 74% of Americans who think that voting gives people like them some say about how the government runs things may be right. Voting certainly does give us something of a voice in our government, and whether that voicing doesn't really depend on what we put on our ballots. It depends more so on the desires of the economic elites. So we can check back into our conversation about the impact and importance of voting. We can now see that voting is not directly impactful on policy, but it certainly is indirectly impactful. If a Democrat is to win the White House, then we would probably have certain Democratic-leaning policies that we would not get under a Republican administration. Or on the flip side, if a Republican were elected to the White House, then we would probably get some policies that we would not have under a Democratic administration. And those are indirect effects that voting can have on policy. Remember, whether those effects actually come to fruition or not depends on the economic elites. So voting does not directly lead to policy. Voting democratically or voting for Democrats or Republicans does not guarantee Democratic or Republican policies. It guarantees a chance of them. Whether that chance becomes a reality depends on the economic elites. So that's impact. And as for importance, remember, non-policy results from voting. We still don't really have a perfect way to measure that. So we'll leave importance as it was with possibly. So now we've discovered 3 interesting things about voting. Number 1, elections aren't necessarily indicative of policy desires. Number 2, economic elites are the gatekeepers of policy, not how we vote. And number 3, we have high incumbency re-election rates. We don't really vote out the people who fail to deliver on the campaign promises they make to us. The promises which are the reasons we elect them in the first place. Despite all that, we still seem to believe that voting can impact society in colossal ways, and we still mobilize people to vote as if voting were our sole source of salvation. This leaves us with, in my opinion, a glaring question. Why do we have such a discrepancy between what people think about voting and what voting actually is? Why is the perceived vote so different from the realistic vote? Well, it turns out that that question ties back to how we define the role of voting in society, and more importantly, it ties back to how we define democracy itself. To delve into all of those questions, I interviewed the Dean of the College of Arts and Science, John Geer. Dean Geer is a political science professor here at Vanderbilt. He specializes in campaigns and elections and public opinion. Furthermore, he is a renowned scholar in electoral politics. Dean Geer, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm very excited to have you.
Well, happy to be here.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin with a sort of zoomed out question. What exactly does it mean for someone's vote to matter?
Well, that's a question that scholars have struggled with and thought about long and hard. I mean, it can matter. Is it going to matter in the sense of affecting the outcome of the election? Probably not. But it can matter for the individual because it provides a sense of engagement, a sense of participation. It can sometimes build a sense of community because, you know, you wear the little label that says I voted. And that's just telling people that I've been part of the process. So there are lots of benefits and ways that voting matters. It's sometimes psychological, sometimes social. And, rarely is it going to make actually determine the outcome. But if enough people who think like you and act like you turn out, then you can push an election in a different way and choose a different candidate.
Would you mind elaborating a little bit more on that notion of sometimes a vote might not make an election?
Yeah, so, let's take the state of Tennessee. If your goal is to shape the outcome of the presidential election, you have really almost no shot of voting here in Tennessee of making that difference. It's a red state. It's going to go for Donald Trump. You can vote and add a vote for Donald Trump or add a vote for Joe Biden, depending on who you vote, but it won't change the outcome. So that's I think, the realities of it. But voting's much more than just being instrumental. It has psychological and societal benefits as well.
How would you define the standard that we set for how our country runs? What do we mean when we say democracy?
Well, that's, you could ask 10 people and get 10 different answers. And not only do you get 10 answers, but it changes over time. When the founding took place, I don't think many people thought much about democracy or even wanted it. And now it becomes much more of a standard. And so if you think of democracy as being, where the public directly decides policy and drives policy, you're going to be pretty disappointed. But if you're talking about driving the general direction of things, that usually works through the power of the vote. I mean, if this country votes for Joe Biden, the country will go in a different direction than if it votes for Donald Trump. Not that you'll be able to predict every aspect of those differences, but in this case, this will change things. And of course, it's not just the president. It's going to be, is the Senate in the hands of the Democrats or the Republicans? That too is going to matter.
It seems like we sometimes set for our democracy the standard that voting will lead to certain changes to specific directions. Why do you think that we set that standard for ourselves?
Well, I think it's partly because we think of ourselves as a democracy and therefore the public should be driving things. And we probably have a little bit of a simplistic notion. If one of Professor Bartels' books, who I know that you talked to, he has a book I think it's called Democracy for Realists. I don't think I have the exact title, but basically he goes through and says, there's kind of these overly optimistic views of democracy that really don't line up with the data. And so, if you really think that your vote's going to drive things, you're going to come up short, but it still is a good standard to aspire to, even though we're coming up short.
Has that standard changed over time in any noticeable ways or as a result of any major events?
Yeah, it's changed in lots of ways. I mean, first of all, the suffrage is expanded. It was basically white property owners at the start, and now, we have a big issue tied to people who, for example, committed a felony, paid their time, and do they get to vote? We have issues tied to immigration, so we still don't have universal suffrage, but it's certainly better than when the country first started, but there's still lots of room for improvement. But we also have had an expansion of the Democratic vote. The Senate was not voted by citizens until the 17th Amendment. The president was originally chosen not by the public, and now it is within the rules of the college. So we've had an expansion of democracy, if you will. We've also had the rise of the referendum, where you actually do get to vote on a particular policy. And that's very common in the West, and a lot of states have it, not all states. But so there have been growth in those opportunities to have a say.
So as we look at this standard and as we think about how our more ideal standard might not necessarily measure up to our actual reality, do you think that it would be possible for us to update the standard so that the, so to say, perceived vote measures up to the realistic vote?
Well, you could, but you might also want to keep that gap there as a way to encourage reform. We want to keep improving the vote. We want to keep improving the system, to form a more perfect union. That's a phrase that doesn't suggest we're perfect. It's rather to try to become more perfect, get to a certain standard. So I think that having some tension between the two, a gap, if you will, is a good thing because it can be the engine of reform.
If the widespread public fully recognized that gap, do you think that we might have anything special change within our country and how we engage with our democracy?
I think there's probably part of the success of Donald Trump, I believe, is because people were angry that they didn't think the system was responsive to them. And there's certainly a lot of people in rural areas that felt left behind in a lot of different ways. And Trump tapped into that anger. And so, yeah, I think, if you were able to show that, if people started thinking they didn't have the power, maybe they'd step up and take the power. I saw a statistic this morning that I thought was very interesting, that of the early vote in Pennsylvania, which is, we know there's so much early vote and everybody's talked about it, how you interpret it is very hard. But 25% of the early voters in this election did not vote in 2016. 25%.
Wow.
That's telling me that people who sat on their hands in 16 are voting now. That's probably not good news for Donald Trump. But that's fascinating because that's suggesting that a lot of people are turning out, and this is going to be a high turnout election, which will, it's good for the country if that's the case.
So we have this sort of discrepancy then, and it can push us to reach greater heights. That's very interesting.
It could, or it could cause depression, and you think it doesn't matter, and so you just disengage. You an optimist or a pessimist? Is the glass half full or half empty? If Professor Bartels and I have been friends for a long, long time, and I'm more of the optimist and he's more of the pessimist. And I think, both views need to be heard, and he has a lot of data for his positions. That conversation in and of itself is what we need. It's not a matter of who's right or wrong. I'd probably put my money on Larry over myself. But that's not, we still have to have these conversations, and it's just good for the country because, imagine if you came to the idea, Nolan, that you knew everything. That'd be pretty terrible because curiosity is what drives us. We don't, we want to learn more. We want to find out stuff, and there's so many things we don't know. And so, somebody's got an idea out there that's going to be really change the system sometime soon. We don't know it yet, but we'll find out about it reasonably soon.
So I guess we just have to strike the middle ground between curiosity killing the cat and curiosity rousing the cat every morning. So it has a mission
Exactly.
for the day.
Maybe we just need to give the cat a little bit of a kick, and that's it.
Well, Dean Geer, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to have you.
No problem. It was good to chat and enjoy putting the finishing touches on what's a promising project.
Thank you. Let's check in. We now know that this discrepancy between the perceived vote and realistic vote is due to our definition of democracy. It's about how the end results we target with our political engagement, or what we want our votes to accomplish, might not necessarily measure up to what those things do in reality. We set really high standards for our country's democracy, and we set really high standards for how we think our democracy's participation opportunities, in other words, how our votes matter. If we think about democracy as letting the public directly decide things, we'll be disappointed. But if we think about democracy as driving the general direction of things, we might not be so disappointed. All of these takeaways line up with Professors Clinton and Bartels. Their perspective that voting gives us a chance, not a guarantee for policy, makes total sense in this context. This discrepancy gives us a chance, not a promise. Furthermore, it lines up with Professor Murray, too. We have to get the economic elites on board in order to have a social change. As Dean Geer said, if people thought that we didn't have the power to make change in society, maybe we would step up and find some way to take that power. Again, connecting with Professor Murray about how social movements can mobilize people and can muster up enough power to get the elites, the gatekeepers of policy, to let certain policies through. So let's check in with our impact and importance of voting debate, our conversation. We can see that voting really pretty clearly has a small direct impact on policy, yet a large indirect impact on policy. And most strikingly now, I think, we can see that we really have a picture starting to form about voting being important. Voting can drive us to do better. It can drive us to change the world. It can drive us to reform things that might not be in as tip-top shape as they could be. So now we have to think about reconciling our democracy with what it takes to actually create policy change. We have to look long and hard at our definition of democracy, and we have to think very deeply about how we interact with democracy. Furthermore, we have to analyze the expectations that we actually set for our votes. To do all of this, I interviewed Professor Allison Anoll, another political science professor from Vanderbilt. Professor Anoll researches how social context, connections, and norms affect political participation, and she specializes in political behavior and political participation. Professor Anoll, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So I'd like to begin with a question to sort of circle back to what we've covered in previous interviews, yet expand our gaze. Does voting matter in ways beyond policy outcomes? Up till now, we've spoken very much through the closed lens of voting creating tangible change in how our country is run. And I'm sure that there are other impacts that come from voting. What might some of those be?
Yeah, so I think when people say, does voting matter, part of what we have to do is think about the definition of the word matter. And usually what people are asking or implying in that question is, does voting affect substantive policy outcomes? So are representatives and the policies they pass affected by who shows up and what individuals do when they vote? But there's value to voting beyond the substantive outcomes. There's value in the process of voting. And so when we think about what a person receives or what they do or how democracy is affected when they choose to vote, we can think about a variety of things. So the first one is the kind of social and psychological benefits that come from the actual process of voting. So one that I've seen a lot in my research is there are a lot of people in the past who have fought really hard and sacrificed a lot for our right to vote. And that is especially true in certain communities in America. A lot has been sacrificed for inclusion into the franchise. And for many of those people, when they show up to vote, they may be highly cynical about the likelihood their vote will actually matter or whether their communities are represented at all in the democratic process, but they show up to honor the past and to honor the struggles and sacrifices of those who came before them. And in doing that, they are building a community, a norm, a sense of what their group is about and what it values and their relationship to both the past and the political process. So in that sense, voting can have these psychological and social benefits that exist through the actual process of voting and not just the outcome. And then there's also a good bit of evidence that shows that voting increases the quality of citizens. So it increases their knowledge over time. That's especially true in states that have high information ballot propositions. We find that as people vote, they actually over time increase their knowledge of politics, which likely makes them more able to engage and demand from their representatives substantive outcomes. And it also increases their feeling that the system is legitimate, which can have a lot of good long-term externalities, like engaging in peaceful protest, supporting transitions of power that are peaceful, believing that the system will respond to you, and as a result, enacting change through that system in a way that avoids violence.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Would you tell us a little bit about low-cost and high-cost forms of political engagement, please, and maybe the benefits that come with those respectively?
Sure. So, when we think about low-cost political participation, really one of the lowest costs of engagement you can do is voting in federal elections. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of money and time is spent making it easy for you to do. So people are making sure you know when the election is, helping you find your polling place, coordinating transportation to the polls. And when you get there, there's basically a binary decision. There's like two people, so you don't need a whole lot of information to make that choice. All those things mean that voting in an election is really pretty low cost. It's not that hard to do. It doesn't take up that much of your time or day or even really that many resources. But there are a lot of higher cost forms of political participation. So deciding that you want to spend your career, for instance, researching political participation is a high cost way of engaging in the political sphere. Or going to a protest where there's likely to be violence, another high likelihood, high cost involved in that process. And so when we think about which of these people are more likely to do, the cost the benefits have to outweigh the cost, especially those social and psychological benefits. So, voting is a pretty easy thing to do. So people do it because there's also social and psychological benefits. But we have to increase those benefits if we want people to do the high cost, hard work of holding democratic representatives accountable. And that's where a lot of the substantive policy outcomes really, really come from.
Well, thank you. I dropped off my absentee ballot today at Station B, the post office this morning, and it was certainly very easy.
Yeah.
I'd like to circle back to something that Professor Murray said. He said that social movements can have enough power, they can muster up this ability to create change in society, as compared to voting, which may or may not create that change. It may be somewhat limited. And the reason for that being that we have these economic elites who are sort of the gatekeepers of policy. So to bring about policy changes, we have to convince the elites to let that social change through the gates of policy. So I think this sort of leaves us with a question. How do social movements challenge the agenda setting and gatekeeping power of the elites versus what voting might?
Yeah, so one of the reasons those elite gatekeepers have so much power is because they get to set the agenda. So I just said, when you go to vote, there's basically a binary choice. There's two really feasible candidates that basically everybody is going to vote for president. That person doesn't actually have all that much information about what the people want. And when they get into the position of power, then they get to set the agenda of which, thousands of policies they actually want to enact. They have a lot of control over that agenda setting of substantive policy outcomes. One of the things a social movement can do to change those outcomes is they can hijack that agenda setting power. So they can push into people's minds that a policy is important enough, salient enough, that it needs the action of those representatives. And suddenly the representatives have to shift their attention to what has been brought onto the agenda by a social movement. Because otherwise, if they're not going to engage with it, if they're not going to do something, they may actually face re-election issues. Right? So, if nobody's paying attention, or if they spend most of their time choosing what to work on in their agenda, then, people don't have that much power to set the agenda. But the goal of a social movement in lots of ways is to set the agenda and then pressure, so that those representatives get concerned that if they don't do something about that new item that's on the agenda, they might lose their power altogether.
Thank you. Are there any common threads that run between social movements that have successfully created these sorts of societal policy type changes?
Yeah, a few things. So, one of the things that seems to really affect whether a social movement can have that agenda and pressure setting power is the scope of the movement. So how many people get involved, how many events there are related to that, all of those things shape this perception that that it's salient and that it needs attention. So scope is a really important part of that. I think also what's really important part of that is often taking something that is seen by many people as normatively important and showing a hypocrisy within that. So if we think, for instance, about the suffrage movement, or we think about the civil rights movement, increasingly the Black Lives Matter movement, part of what those are really built on foundationally is saying, you've said that all people should be able to engage in this political system. Look at how hypocritical your constitution is. Look at how hypocritical the police are. Look at how hypocritical the concept of safety is. So there is both a very tactical component of social movements that makes them successful, a lot of planning, a lot of work, thinking about the scope, thinking about how you set the agenda and pressure, but also this very normative element that makes it seem to people like, yeah, this is something that should be on our agenda. This is something that I understand why it needs to be fixed.
So it seems like there are a lot of issue-driven or policy-driven social movements around. And I guess this year, especially being an election year, it seems like there's a huge social movement simply to get people to vote. This is interesting in the context of what Dean Geer said. Dean Geer said that we set a really high standard for our country's democracy. We like to think that our democracy lets the public decide things, even though that standard might not be perfectly accurate or perfectly realistic. So in that context, how do we make sense of these social movements that are focused on getting people to vote? Seeing as these movements want to create policy change ultimately, why do they focus on voting as a way to impact society when we're coming to understand that voting might not be as all-powerful as we think?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to answer this question. First is that politics is really complex and people's lives are really busy. So expecting them to have a lot of very well-formed opinions about all of the various components of politics is a totally unrealistic expectation. So, understanding whether the people have total control of their democracy or whether it's actually, in fact, totally reasonable to suggest that at some level the leaders or the elites, the gatekeepers, are choosing between these policies that people don't know about, I don't think it undermines that democracy doesn't work if we think that is in fact what's happening, that people have general ideas and then policymakers have specific ideas. But the second part of this is that while individuals might not make a lot of difference, blocks of people can make a lot of difference in voting outcomes. And that is especially true at, for instance, the state and local level. It's harder to fully see, well, I should say, it takes nuance to see and interpret at the federal level. So for instance, there's this paper that I think is very, very good, which looks at what would happen if we re-enfranchise people who have felony convictions in a place like Florida. So a swing state which disproportionately disenfranchises Black people as a result of felony convictions. So as you might know, whether you can vote with a felony conviction depends on the state you live in. And there are places like Tennessee, my home state of Virginia, Florida, that makes it so you can never vote again if you have a felony conviction. So if you have a low-level drug offense when you're 18, you can never vote again, which means that in those states, primarily the people who don't have the right to vote are not in jail, they're not in prison, they're not in probation, they're like 60 years old and they had a felony conviction a long time ago. So this paper shows what would happen in presidential and congressional elections if you enfranchised everyone in Florida. Right? And what this paper shows is that, actually only a handful of outcomes would have changed. We might have had one different president. We might have had a few different congressional representatives. But because of incumbency advantage, that could shift a whole downstream line of who is in those positions of power, totally rearranging the majorities that each of these Senate and congressional bodies have. And so even though it's sometimes hard to see how voting outcomes affect, say, a single policy, we can see how patterns would be affected over time. Would Al Gore have been a different president than Bush? I guess it's hard to know for sure. We can't go back and create some counterfactual, but some things about the world probably would have been different. Now, that's even clearer at the state and local level, where inequalities in turnout, for instance, by income or race, have big and really long-lasting effects on, for instance, income distribution and access to welfare policies. That we really know. And so the social movement's goal is to try to set the agenda. Part of what they're trying to do is mobilize blocks of people, blocks of certain types of people, in hope of creating a world where one leader is going to be more open to their agenda-setting abilities than the others.
Would you mind going into a little bit more depth, please, about how that sort of re-enfranchisement would affect incumbency?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we know that in the United States, once a person wins election, there are a lot of things that make it easier for them to win again. So name recognition, the resources of being in office, experience, all those things make it so that incumbents, once they're in the position, they tend to stay. Incumbent presidents tend to win again. Incumbent congressmen people also tend to win again. And so if a person at the very first time they got elected had been different, then not only would that election have been different, likely have been different, but rather the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elections may have been different because that incumbent would have been different, right? The resources empowered with the incumbent would have been different. And so things like, when this paper suggests, the 1994 coalition around Newt Gingrich that really consolidated an extreme conservative religious right in America may never have formed, right? It's hard to know what the counterfactual is, but we can think that the United States may have been different if that had been the case.
Interesting. Thank you. I have one final question for you, if I may, please. So when we take all of this into consideration and we really start to recognize sort of the perceived vote, the realistic vote, the gap, and how that can push us into social movements that can really strive for and create changes, what do we think about on election day when all of this comes together and when it's the time for us to cast our ballots? What should we keep in our brains?
Yeah, look, I have spent the last 10 years thinking about, reading about American political participation, including voting. And at the end of the day, I do not think that my individual specific vote will have any effect on the outcome of this election. Any effect. So in the logical world, why would I do it at all? You know, there's other things that demand my time, my children, my book, my lawn, my sleep. You know, I could do any of those things instead of register at my new address and probably go stand in a line, which I'm going to have to do. Why would I do it? Because of those intrinsic benefits. You know, those intrinsic benefits. I do it to honor the past. I do it out of my beliefs that politics is a way to help people in need. I do it because, you know, I have to teach voting and representation in the spring, and I would feel like a total hypocrite if I was standing up there telling them about the value of political participation and I hadn't voted. So, which really points out the fact that, you know, the reasons we vote are much more complex than substantive outcomes, and we should think of them as the start. Okay, I'm doing something that is helping me affirm my beliefs. It helps me understand what my political positions are, helps remind me that democracy is a thing, helps remind me that representatives are supposed to be responsive to me. And I know that this one act isn't going to do that. And as a result, I have to do more. If I want to enact those things, I have to do more. So I think we should think of it as anything, a gateway, and part of the ways we affirm to ourselves what it means to be a citizen in the United States.
Well, thank you, Professor Anoll. I know that you've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure the same is true for all of our viewers out there. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So let's check in and start to wrap up. Where does all of this leave us? Well, I would say that there are three key takeaways from everything we've covered up until now. Number one, voting does not guarantee policy because the economic elites are the gatekeepers of policy. Number two, to open those gates to policies that we want passed, we have to convince the elites to side with us in some form or fashion. And number three, the best way to convince the elites to side with us is through some sort of social movement. So if you're not already a member of the economic elite class, you can still get the policies you want passed. It just won't totally be through voting. It'll be through something else. So this leaves us with a big question, right? I would argue the same question we've been trying to answer this whole time. Is voting impactful and is voting important? Well, we can now see unequivocally that voting is indeed impactful. Voting is impactful by virtue of what comes next. Your vote will not make or break an election. You're more likely to be struck by lightning, such as on the way to the polling place, rather than to have your vote tip an election at the polling place. So if you can make it to the polling place, in other words, chances are your vote will not make the election fall one way or the other. However, this does not mean that voting lacks impact, lacks meaning when it comes to policy change. Voting makes us engage with our political system, and voting makes us take the first step in pursuing substantive change in the country. Voting opens a door, and it's up to us to walk through it. Voting is impactful because it is step one in a multi-step process. So yes, voting is impactful. Is it important? Yes, voting is important. As Professor Anoll outlined, there are tons of non-substantive benefits that come from voting. Voting is both impactful and important. Voting is something that is worth doing because it's the beginning of us having a voice in the country. Voting isn't a voice in and of itself. It's a path to a voice. It's a path for us to find a way to show up, for us to find a way to let our voices be heard, for us to find a way to interact with a city that might be really close or really far from you, depending on how close you live to DC. Voting is a way for us to share our opinions and for us to play even a small role in the government of our country and the governing of our country, because voting opens a door. I think Aaron Sorkin, the creator of The West Wing, summarizes this takeaway very nicely in his May 2012 commencement address at Syracuse University.
But it seems to me that more and more we've come to expect less and less of each other, and that's got to change. Your friends, your family, this school expect more of you than vocational success. Today is May 13th, and today you graduate, and the rules are about to change, and one of them is this: decisions are made by those who show up. Don't ever forget that you're a citizen of this world. Don't ever forget that you're a citizen of this world, and there are things you can do to lift the human spirit, things that are easy, things that are free, things that you can do every day. Civility, respect, kindness, character. You're too good for schadenfreude. You're too good for gossip and snark. You're too good for intolerance. And since you're walking into the middle of a presidential election, it's worth mentioning that you're too good to think people who disagree with you are your enemy.
This speech, actually, is an echo of an earlier rendition of this same idea from Aaron Sorkin. It's an echo of the season 1 finale of The West Wing.
There's another one. Two politicians are having an argument. One of them stands up and shouts, "You're lying." The other one says, "Yes, I am, but hear me out."
Mr. President, we have time for one more question.
I don't think I answered the last one yet. Suzanne's got me telling jokes. Suzanne, there is an answer to your question, but I don't think you're going to like it. You ready? The current crop of 18 to 25-year-olds is the most politically apathetic generation in American history. In 1972, half of that age group voted. In the last election, it was 32%. Your generation is considerably less likely than any previous one to write or call public officials, attend rallies, or work on political campaigns. A man once said this: decisions are made by those who show up. So are we failing you, or are you failing us? It's a little of both.
We can return to our original question posed by Hartsfield's Landing, the episode depicted in A West Wing special to benefit When We All Vote. Does voting matter? Yes, it does. We arrive by voting, but we show up when we take the next step. As Bartlett said, it takes more than just voting to show up. You have to be politically engaged to pursue change. Decisions are made by those who show up. So show up. So next Tuesday on November 3rd, 2020, on Election Day, we each have an opportunity to vote. We each have an opportunity to arrive at the ballot box. We each have an opportunity to say who we would like to sit behind the resolute desk for the next 4 years in the Oval Office of the West Wing of the White House. What's more important than what we do next Tuesday, though, is what we do next Wednesday. We show up. Next Tuesday, we arrive. Next Wednesday, the real work begins. We show up, as Sorkin said. We lift the human spirit through civility, respect, kindness, character. We show up by looking for opportunities to help the people around us every day. We show up by constantly, consistently, and unendingly bringing the best versions of ourselves everywhere we go. Maybe the discrepancy between the perceived vote and the realistic vote is somewhat confining. Maybe it's also somewhat liberating. My name is Nolan Siegel. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you next Wednesday.